"You're not what I requested," Ethan Caldwell said, looking straight through her like she was nothing. The whole town of Willow Creek was watching, waiting for her to cry, to beg, to turn around and climb back on that train. Clara Bennett stood in the Wyoming heat with one worn suitcase, a broken latch, and 11 cents in her pocket. She had traveled 4 days to marry a man who just told her in front of everyone that she wasn't good enough. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "Good, because what you requested wouldn't have saved this ranch." Then she walked straight past him. Subscribe to our channel. Follow this story until the very end, and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far Clara's story travels. The train pulled into Willow Creek at 2:30 in the afternoon, and by 2:31, the entire population of the town had already decided what kind of woman Clara Bennett was. They decided she was wrong. Wrong for Wyoming. Wrong for Caldwell Ridge Ranch. Wrong for a man like Ethan Caldwell, who owned 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land in the territory, and whose name alone could make a banker stand up straighter. They had expected silk. They had expected pearls. They had expected the kind of woman who arrived in a private rail car with hat boxes and a personal maid, and the confident posture of someone who believed the world owed her a beautiful life. What stepped off that train instead was a woman in a faded blue cotton dress carrying a single worn suitcase with a broken brass latch that she held shut with her left hand. Her boots were practical and dust-covered. Her dark hair was pinned back without ceremony. She stood 5'4" and looked like she'd spent her whole life outdoors doing work that nobody thanked her for. She was 25 years old. She didn't look fragile. She didn't look afraid. But she did look at the crowd watching her, at the row of curious faces lining the platform. And she understood immediately what every single one of them was thinking. She had seen that look before. She'd been seeing it her whole life. Ethan Caldwell stood at the edge of the platform, his foreman Roy Briggs at his shoulder. Ethan was 41 years old, broad across the chest, with weathered hands and dark eyes that gave nothing away. He wore no expression that could be called welcoming. He wore no expression that could be called anything at all. He simply watched the woman walking toward him, and the longer he watched, the more something shifted behind those careful eyes. Not exactly, not contempt, but the particular kind of quiet that comes when a man realizes the world has not delivered what he ordered. Clara stopped in front of him. She set her suitcase down, held it with her foot so the latch wouldn't spring open, and extended her right hand. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I'm Clara Bennett." He shook her hand once, brief, businesslike. "Miss Bennett," he said, "I see you arrived safely." "I did." A pause stretched between them. Roy shifted his weight beside Ethan, studying the toe of his boot. "You look different," Ethan finally said, "than what I was led to expect." Clara tilted her head slightly. "Different how?" He didn't answer that directly. What he said instead, quietly enough that only the three of them could hear it, was, "This isn't what I requested." The crowd was too far away to hear the words. But everyone watching saw Clara's face, saw the way she received it, the moment of stillness that followed the almost imperceptible tightening around her jaw. And then she said, "I didn't come here because I was what you expected, Mr. Caldwell. I came because I know how to build something from nothing." She picked up her suitcase. She looked at Roy. "Is there a wagon?" she asked. Roy blinked, glanced at Ethan, and said, "Yes, ma'am, right this way." She followed him without looking back. The ride out to Caldwell Ridge took 40 minutes along a road that told its own story. First the town with its painted storefronts and its careful respectability. Then the land itself opening up without apology, wide and windswept and enormous in a way that either broke a person or made them feel for the first time entirely free. Clara sat in the back of the wagon. Ethan rode his horse alongside it, never too close, never too far, and never once looking at her directly for more than a moment. Roy made conversation because Roy was the kind of man who filled silences with words the way other men filled them with whiskey. "How was the journey, ma'am? You come all the way from Ohio," the letter said. "Indiana," Clara said. "Near a town called Millbrook." "Long trip." 4 days and 3 nights. Roy nodded with genuine sympathy. "You hungry Mrs. Alcott? She's the cook at the main house. She keeps a pot going most times." "I could eat," Clara said. "Thank you." She said it plainly. No performance of gratitude, no anxious over-politeness. She answered his question the way someone answers when they mean exactly what they say. Roy liked her immediately and couldn't have explained why, except that she seemed real in a way that most people arriving at Caldwell Ridge weren't. Most visitors performed something wealth graciousness importance the moment they arrived. This woman had apparently decided she had nothing to perform. Ethan, riding 20 feet to the side, heard every word and filed them away without acknowledgement. The main house was large enough to be called impressive, but Clara didn't call it impressive. She walked through the front door, set her suitcase beside the entrance, and stood still for a moment in the front hallway. She turned her head slowly, like a woman taking inventory. Not of the furniture or the paintings or the quality of the woodwork, though. All of those things were considerable. She was listening, paying attention to something less visible. Roy introduced Mrs. Alcott, who was a stout woman in her late 50s, with flour on her apron and suspicion in her eyes. "Ma'am," Mrs. Alcott said. The tone was civil and nothing else. "It's good to meet you," Clara said. "I can smell something wonderful from the kitchen." Mrs. Alcott softened fractionally. "Beef stew. It'll be ready by 6. Can I help?" The question landed like a small stone into a still pond. Mrs. Alcott stared at her. "Help in the kitchen this afternoon. You don't need to." "I know I don't need to," Clara said. "I want to. I work better when I know how a kitchen is organized. Every kitchen has its own logic. I'd rather learn yours than impose my own." Mrs. Alcott opened her mouth and then closed it again. Then she said slowly, "I suppose that'd be all right." Clara nodded, picked up her suitcase and said, "If someone could show me my room, I'll put my things away and come back down." Roy showed her up. On the staircase quietly enough that Clara couldn't hear, Roy leaned slightly toward Ethan and said, "She's not what I expected either." Ethan said nothing, but he watched the staircase for a moment after she disappeared. Dinner that night was the first real test. At Caldwell Ridge, the ranch hands ate in a separate bunkhouse, as was the custom on most large Wyoming operations. But the senior staff, Roy the head wrangler, Jake Mercer, and the 2 foremen of the northern and southern range, Holt Dawson and Samuel Carter, ate at the long table in the back of the main house kitchen, a tradition that had started with Ethan's father and continued because nobody had ever suggested stopping it. Clara came down to the table, already knowing 2 things she hadn't known 2 hours ago. She knew that the kitchen supply system was hemorrhaging money through waste and poor planning. She'd seen it in 20 minutes of quiet observation while she helped Mrs. Alcott chop carrots. And she knew that Samuel Carter, the foreman of the Southern Range, hadn't eaten a full meal at that table in at least 3 weeks, because Mrs. Alcott mentioned it in passing with the particular resignation of someone who had stopped asking why. Clara sat at the table. Ethan sat at the head. Everyone else arranged themselves in the established order of their importance, which was apparently a very serious subject, judged by how carefully they navigated it. The stew was served. Biscuits passed around. A few polite words exchanged about cattle prices and weather. Clara ate. She didn't try to charm anyone. She didn't work the room. She asked Jake Mercer a straightforward question about the horses. "How many do you run?" and listened to the answer with actual interest, following it up with a question that proved she'd understood it. Jake, who was not accustomed to being asked real questions and then actually listened to, sat up slightly straighter. Holt Dawson told a story about a fence line dispute with a neighboring operation. Clara asked one clarifying question. Holt realized mid-sentence that the clarifying question cut straight to the part of the problem nobody had named yet, and he stopped talking and looked at her for a moment. "Good point," he said. "Just that." Samuel Carter said nothing through any of it. He ate maybe a third of his stew. Clara noticed but didn't address it. Not yet. At the end of dinner, Ethan spoke to Clara for the first time since the wagon. "I'll go over the household accounts with you tomorrow morning," he said. 8 o'clock. "That works," Clara said. "There are expectations," he continued, and his tone made clear he was stating facts, not asking for agreement. This is a working ranch, not a social establishment. The role you're taking on has specific duties. I'll outline them." Clara met his eyes. "I'm sure you will." A beat of silence. "Good night, Miss Bennett." "Good night, Mr. Caldwell." She went upstairs. Roy stared at his empty bowl. Jake Mercer looked at Holt Dawson. Neither of them said a word about it that night, but they both thought the same thing: that woman was going to be something one way or the other. 3 days passed. In those 3 days, Clara did not introduce herself dramatically to anyone. She did not make announcements about changes she intended to make. She did not ask Ethan for permission before she did anything practical, because nothing she did in those first 3 days required his permission. She was reorganizing a linen closet, fixing a hinge on the back pantry door, learning which of the ranch hands had dietary restrictions based on quiet conversation rather than formal inquiry. What she was actually doing, what nobody noticed consciously until later, was mapping the ranch the way a surgeon maps a patient. Not the landscape, not the cattle numbers, or the acreage, or the revenue. Those were Ethan's domain, and she had no interest in trespassing on them. She was mapping the people. On the morning of the 4th day, she walked into Mrs. Alcott's kitchen before sunrise and found the cook already there, not cooking, but sitting at the work table with both hands around a coffee cup, staring at the far wall with the expression of a woman carrying something too heavy to put down. Clara poured herself a cup without asking. She sat across the table. She didn't say anything immediately. Eventually, Mrs. Alcott said, "You're an early riser." "Always have been," Clara said. "Habit from home. My mother started the stove at 4:30 every morning. I used to sit with her." "Your mother's still living?" "No, she passed when I was 17. Mrs. Alcott looked at her for the first time that morning. "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Clara wrapped both hands around her cup the same way Mrs. Alcott had. "She taught me everything I know about feeding people. She used to say that a woman who can cook well enough will never go without a home." A pause. "She was right," Mrs. Alcott said. "Mostly." Clara nodded, then not pushing, not pressing, simply asking, because she genuinely wanted to know. "How long have you been here, Mrs. Alcott?" 11 years, came after Mr. Caldwell's wife passed. Mrs. Caldwell. Margaret. The name arrived with weight. She was a good woman. This house was different then. Different how? Mrs. Alcott looked at her. She seemed to be calculating something, how much to trust, what it would cost her. She had been asking herself that calculation for 11 years, and she was tired of it. "Warmer," she said finally. "It was warmer." Clara didn't respond with sympathy, designed to encourage more sharing. She simply nodded, as though that one word explained everything necessary, and somehow it did. On the morning of the 5th day, Ethan Caldwell discovered his new bride in the middle of the bunkhouse yard at 7 in the morning, sitting on an overturned crate across from Thomas Reed, who was 70 years old and had been working Caldwell Ridge for 2 decades and rarely spoke to anyone voluntarily. Thomas Reed was talking. Not a little. A lot. His weathered hands moved as he spoke. He was leaning forward. He was smiling, actually smiling in the particular way of a person who has suddenly been given permission to say things they stopped believing anyone wanted to hear. Clara was listening. Her whole body was angled toward him. She wasn't nodding politely or waiting for him to finish. She was listening the way she cooked, with full attention, like it mattered. Ethan stopped walking. He watched for a moment. Long enough to hear the end of whatever Thomas was saying, which was something about a cattle drive in '68 and a river crossing that went wrong and a horse called Juniper who had saved his life. "Did you ever look for that horse afterward?" Clara asked. "Looked for 3 years," Thomas said. "Never found her. Always figured she found somewhere better." "I think she probably did," Clara said. Thomas Reed laughed. An actual laugh. Ethan turned and walked back the other direction before either of them saw him. He didn't know what to call the feeling that came with what he'd just witnessed. He'd watched this woman arrive 5 days ago with one suitcase and a broken latch and receive the most humiliating possible greeting from the man who'd sent for her. She hadn't cried. She hadn't left. She hadn't sulked or maneuvered or schemed. She had sat down with an old man that Ethan himself hadn't actually talked to in years and listened to him like he was the most interesting person she'd ever met. Ethan walked to the fence at the edge of the north pasture and stood there for a while, looking at his land. He was beginning to understand something about Clara Bennett that unsettled him completely. She hadn't come to Caldwell Ridge to be taken care of. She had come to take care of it. The confrontation when it came was not dramatic. It didn't announce itself. It happened on the 6th evening just before dinner when Ethan walked through the kitchen and found Clara standing at the supply ledger he kept on the back shelf. The household ledger, not the ranch accounts, with a pencil in her hand and an expression of focused concentration. "What are you doing?" he asked. His voice was flat, but not angry. It was the voice of a man who asked questions the way other men issued warnings. Clara looked up. She didn't close the ledger. "Looking at the supply records," she said. "I can see that." "Do you want me to stop?" A pause. "I want to know why you started," he said. She set the pencil down and turned to face him fully. "Because in the past 5 days, I've watched this kitchen go through twice the amount of flour it needs for a household this size. The beef portions are miscounted from the main supply. 2 of the weekly market orders are duplicated. You're paying for items you already have in the storeroom. It's not anyone's fault. It's just a system that hasn't been looked at in a while." Ethan stared at her. "How much?" he said. "In waste, roughly $40 a month, maybe more." Another pause. "Show me," he said. She turned the ledger back toward him and walked him through it line by line. She didn't hurry. She didn't apologize for having looked. She explained what she found. The way someone explains something to a person they respect, clearly, specifically, without performing either confidence or humility. Ethan asked 3 questions. Sharp questions, the kind that tested whether she actually understood what she was telling him, or was simply reporting what she'd seen. She answered all 3 without hesitation and without defensiveness. When they were done, he stepped back from the ledger. "All right," he said. "Fix it. I'll need to talk to Mrs. Alcott about the kitchen side. Mrs. Alcott answers to me. I know that. I'm not planning to go around her. I'm planning to work with her. But I wanted you to know that's what I intend to do." Ethan studied her for a moment. "Why?" he asked, not hostile, genuinely asking. Clara tilted her head slightly. "Because you're the kind of man who doesn't like surprises," she said. "And because I'd rather not spend the next 20 years navigating your household by guessing what you'll tolerate." The word 20 years landed differently than either of them expected. It made the marriage real in a way the train station hadn't. In a way the dinner table hadn't. In a way nothing so far had. 20 years. Ethan said nothing. Clara picked up her pencil. "I'll have the corrected ledger entries ready by Friday," she said. She went back to work. Ethan stood in the kitchen doorway for one more moment. Then he left without another word. But that night, for the first time in longer than he could honestly name, Ethan Caldwell sat at the dinner table and stayed after the meal was finished. He asked Jake Mercer a question about the northern horses. He listened to the answer. Roy, who noticed everything, caught Clara's eye from across the table. She gave him nothing. No smile, no acknowledgement, no satisfaction. But Roy knew what he was seeing. Something in this house had shifted, and the woman who'd arrived with one broken suitcase had been the one to shift it. On the 9th night, Samuel Carter didn't come to dinner. Clara noticed the empty chair but said nothing at the table. After the meal, when Roy was heading out and the others had dispersed, she stopped him at the door. "Samuel," she said quietly. Roy stopped. "He hasn't eaten a full meal since I arrived," Clara said. "Maybe before that. What happened?" Roy looked at her for a long moment. He sighed. "His wife left," Roy said. "Took the kids back east, 6 months ago. He got a letter last week. She's filing for divorce." Clara took that in without rushing past it. "Does Ethan know?" she asked. "Ethan knows. He told Samuel to take a week if he needed it. Samuel said he didn't need it. He's been working harder since." Roy's voice carried the particular helplessness of a man watching someone else drown in silence. "He won't talk about it. He doesn't need to talk about it," Clara said. "He needs someone to notice." She walked to the kitchen, put together a covered plate of food, and walked out to the bunkhouse. She knocked on the door. Samuel opened it. He was fully dressed, which told her he hadn't been sleeping. His face carried the specific blankness of a man who had decided the safest thing was to feel nothing. "Mrs. Caldwell." His voice was steady, careful. "I brought your dinner," Clara said. She held out the plate. He stared at it. "You don't need to come in," she said. "I'm not going to make you talk. I just thought you should eat something." Samuel Carter took the plate from her hands. He stood in the doorway holding it. His jaw worked once. "Thank you," he said. The two words came out rougher than he'd intended, like something that had been stuck for a long time and finally moved. "Good night, Samuel," Clara said. She walked back to the main house. Behind her, Samuel Carter stood in his doorway for a long time, holding a plate of beef stew that was still warm. For the first time in 6 months, he ate all of it. By the end of the second week, Caldwell Ridge had begun to change in ways nobody could have pointed to exactly, but everyone could feel. The kitchen ran better. The waste was down. Mrs. Alcott had stopped wearing her suspicion like armor and had started treating Clara cautiously like a colleague. Thomas Reed had taken to saving a spot at the morning fire for Clara because she came out early sometimes and talked with him, and talking with her felt like being seen after years of being invisible. Luke Harper, 22 years old and quietly desperate to be something more than a cattle hand, had mentioned once to Clara that he'd trained horses as a boy on his family's farm. She'd mentioned it to Roy. Roy had mentioned it to Ethan. Ethan had said nothing. But 3 days later, Luke was reassigned to the horse training operation with a new set of responsibilities and a modest increase in pay. Luke never knew how it happened. Clara never told him. But Roy knew, and Roy understood with a clarity that surprised him what kind of woman they were dealing with. She didn't take credit. She didn't build a monument to her own generosity. She just moved things into better positions and stepped back. The morning of the 14th day, Ethan found Clara at the kitchen table before sunrise writing a letter. She didn't hear him come in. He almost announced himself, then decided not to, and poured his own coffee and watched her write for a moment. She was left-handed. Her handwriting was quick and direct, not elegant, but clear. She wrote like she did everything else without wasting motion. Eventually, she looked up and saw him. She didn't startle. She simply acknowledged his presence with a slight nod. "Early," he said. "Always," she said. He sat down across the table, not close enough to read her letter, far enough to make clear he had no intention of prying. "Who are you writing?" he asked. "My sister. She's in Indiana. I promised I'd write when I arrived." "You're 2 weeks late on that promise." Clara looked at him, almost a smile. "I was finding the right things to say." "Did you find them?" She looked down at the letter. "Some of them." "What did you tell her?" Clara set her pen down. She considered the question with the same seriousness she gave everything. "I told her the ranch is beautiful," she said. "I told her the land is bigger than anything I'd ever imagined. I told her the people here are good people." A pause. "What else?" he asked. Clara looked at him across the table in the quiet before sunrise. "I told her I think I made the right choice," she said. The kitchen was very still. Ethan wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked down at it for a moment. Then he looked back up at her. "Good," he said. Just that one word. But the way he said it carried something he hadn't meant to let out, something careful and genuine, and for Ethan Caldwell extraordinarily unguarded. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. "I'll have breakfast started in a few minutes," she said. "No hurry," Ethan said. He stayed at the table. For the first time in a very long time, Ethan Caldwell sat in his own kitchen in the early morning quiet and didn't feel alone in it. Outside, the Wyoming sky was beginning to pale at the edges. The ranch was waking up. And something that had been sleeping for years, something that had nothing to do with cattle or land or profit, was waking up too. The letter Clara wrote to her sister that morning was 3 pages long. She never mentioned that Ethan had sat across from her while she finished it. She never mentioned the way he'd held his coffee cup with both hands, like a man trying to warm something from the inside out. She never mentioned that he'd stayed at that table until Roy knocked on the back door at 6:30, and that when he left he said, "Good morning" to her, the way someone says it when they actually mean it, not as a formality, but as something chosen. She told her sister the land was bigger than anything she'd imagined. She told her sister she thought she'd made the right choice. What she didn't write, what she couldn't write yet, because she didn't have words for it, was the feeling that had settled into her chest that morning, like a coal catching heat for the first time. Not hope exactly. Not comfort. Something more fragile than either. The sense that in this enormous, complicated, half-broken place, she might actually be necessary. Clara Bennett had never in her life been anywhere that needed her the way Caldwell Ridge needed her. She intended to find out exactly how deep that need went. She found out faster than she expected. It was Roy who came to her first on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after her arrival with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that told her he'd been thinking about this conversation for days before he'd decided to have it. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said. "You got a minute?" "I've got several," she said. "Sit down." He sat. He turned his hat in his hands twice. He was a man who spoke plainly when he spoke, but getting to the speaking sometimes took him a while. "It's about the bunkhouse supply account," he said finally. Clara set down the linen she'd been mending. "Tell me, we've been ordering feed through a supplier in Laramie for 6 years. Same man, same prices, same schedule. But 3 months ago the prices went up. Not a little significant. Ethan approved it because the man's been reliable and switching suppliers mid-season causes problems." Roy paused. "But I've been doing some checking. The prices that supplier is charging us now are higher than what anyone else in the territory is paying." "How much higher?" "About 30%. Clara was quiet for a moment. "Does Ethan know that comparison?" "No. He knows the prices went up. He doesn't know how much they went up relative to the market. I didn't want to bring it to him without—" Roy stopped. "Without having someone else look at it first," Clara finished. Roy nodded. The relief on his face was the relief of a man who had found someone willing to carry something with him. "Show me the invoices," Clara said. He brought them that afternoon. 6 months of feed invoices along with what he'd been able to gather from conversations with suppliers in 2 neighboring counties. Clara spread them on the kitchen table and went through them the way she went through everything methodically, without rushing, following each number to its conclusion before moving to the next. By the time she'd finished, she had a very clear picture. The Laramie supplier, a man named Gerard Hollis, had been inflating Caldwell Ridge's prices steadily over the past 4 months. Not dramatically enough to trigger an immediate alarm, but consistently enough that over a full year it would represent a loss of several $1,000s. "Is Hollis connected to anyone else we do business with?" Clara asked. Roy thought about it. "He and Victor Hayes have done business together. I know that. Hayes uses him for his eastern operations." Clara looked up from the invoices. "Victor Hayes. You've heard the name." Holt mentioned him. Said there'd been some dispute about fence lines. "There's always some dispute about something with Hayes," Roy said, and his voice carried a specific tiredness. The tiredness of a man who has been managing someone else's threat for years. "He's wanted the water rights on our eastern boundary for a long time. The creek that runs through that section feeds 3 of our summer pastures. Without it, we'd have to move nearly 800 head of cattle to the western range, and it'd cost us significantly." "Has he made an offer for the rights?" "Twice. Ethan turned him down both times. Hayes isn't used to being told no." Clara looked at the invoices again. "Roy," she said slowly, "if someone wanted to make this ranch look less profitable than it is to create pressure for a sale, or to create conditions where Ethan might need financing, what would that look like?" Roy went very still. "It would look like higher operational costs," he said. "Gradual, hard to trace, over time." "Yes," Clara said. They looked at each other across the kitchen table. "I need 2 more weeks of information before I say anything to Ethan," Clara said. "I don't want to hand him a theory. I want to hand him a pattern." Roy nodded slowly. You think Hayes is behind this? I think it's worth finding out, Clara said. Can you get me the invoices from the northern fence repairs last spring and the lumber supply account from the winter before that? I can get them by tomorrow morning. Then bring them tomorrow morning. Roy stood. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived with a broken suitcase 3 weeks ago and was now sitting at his kitchen table, quietly dismantling a financial scheme that none of the men who'd been here for years had caught. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, why are you doing this? Clara looked up at him. Because it's my ranch too, she said simply. Roy put his hat on and walked out. He didn't say another word. He didn't need to. That single sentence had just changed everything about how he understood Clara Bennett. She wasn't a bride trying to prove herself. She wasn't a woman trying to earn her place. She was a woman who had already decided this place was hers, not because of the marriage certificate, not because of Ethan's name, but because she had chosen it. Because she had looked at this half-broken, half-beautiful operation and recognized it as something worth protecting. Roy had been at Caldwell Ridge for 16 years. He had watched it survive drought and disease and the death of a beloved woman, and a grief that had gone on so long, it had become indistinguishable from the man carrying it. He had never not once felt as certain as he felt walking across that yard that Caldwell Ridge was going to be all right. The certainty surprised him. He hadn't realized he'd stopped believing it. He realized now that he had, and Clara Bennett had given it back to him in the time it took to say 7 words. That terrified him a little. It also felt like the first honest breath he'd taken in years. The town of Willow Creek had its own opinion about Clara Caldwell, which was what people had started calling her, even though she and Ethan had not yet formally finalized the marriage in anything beyond the arrangement. The opinion was divided. There were those mostly women who had lived practical lives and recognized a practical woman when they saw one who had decided early on that Clara Bennett was exactly what this territory needed more of, and that Ethan Caldwell was either the luckiest or the smartest man in Wyoming for choosing her, depending on whether you believed he'd chosen her intentionally or stumbled into it. Then there were those who had a different view entirely. Clara encountered that view for the first time on a Wednesday morning, 5 weeks after her arrival, when she drove the supply wagon into town to collect the weekly market order. She was tying the horses at the post outside Farley's general store when she heard 2 women talking on the boardwalk behind her. They weren't bothering to lower their voices enough. That's her, the first voice said. Caldwell's mail-order bride. Doesn't look like much, said the second. That's what I heard. Showed up looking like a field hand. Ethan was not pleased apparently. Well, he can't send her back now. Marriage contract. Poor man, all that money, and he ends up with that. Clara finished tying the horses. She turned around. The 2 women, both well-dressed, both somewhere north of 50, both wearing the specific expression of people caught saying something they'd planned to say, went quiet. Clara looked at them for a moment. Not with anger, not with hurt. With the level, steady attention of a woman who has heard worse and survived it. Good morning, she said pleasantly. She walked into the store. Inside, she collected her order from Jim Farley, who was a decent man, in the way that decent men in small towns are decent. He'd been kind to her in the early weeks, called her by name, asked genuine questions. He noticed the set of her jaw as she came in. You all right, Mrs. Caldwell? Fine, she said. I need to add dried apricots to the order. Mrs. Alcott forgot to put them on the list. Of course. Jim wrote it down. Then carefully, quietly, don't pay those 2 any mind. Eleanor Whitmore and her friend talk about everyone eventually. It doesn't mean anything. I know it doesn't, Clara said. Your reputation out at the Ridge is considerable, Jim said. The boys from the ranch come in here twice a week. They've been... He paused, choosing words, enthusiastic, about you. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? Jim smiled slightly. Young Luke Harper came in here last week to pick up a special order of leather conditioner for the saddle room. I asked him how things were going out at the Ridge. He said, and I'm quoting here, Mrs. Caldwell figured out I was born to work horses. She didn't make a big thing of it. She just made it happen. Jim set his hands on the counter. That boy has wanted to work horses his whole life. You managed something in 5 weeks that nobody in this territory managed in years." Clara was quiet for a moment. "He's the one who made it happen," she said. "He showed up every morning. He did the work." "That's true," Jim said. "But somebody had to see him first." Clara paid for her order and loaded it into the wagon. The 2 women on the boardwalk had gone by the time she came back out. She stood for a moment beside the horses, her hand on the nearest one's neck, and let herself feel just for a moment privately, with no audience, the full weight of what Jim Farley had said. She was used to being underestimated. She'd been underestimated for so long that she'd stopped expecting anything else. But something about standing in that store, hearing that a 22-year-old boy had found the words for what she'd tried to give him. Not a gift, not a favor. Just the act of being seen, something about that moved through her in a way she hadn't prepared for. She pressed her lips together. She blinked twice. Then she climbed up onto the wagon and drove home. She had invoices to review. The pattern Roy had suspected was becoming clearer every day, and Clara intended to have something concrete to show Ethan before the week was out. What she didn't know, what nobody at Caldwell Ridge knew yet, was that Victor Hayes had already been watching. He'd seen Clara in town. He'd asked questions about her. He'd gotten the answer most people in Willow Creek were still arriving at slowly, that she was not what anyone had expected, and that what she was doing at that ranch was more significant than a new wife reorganizing linen closets. Hayes was smart enough to understand what that meant. And smart men who wanted something almost always moved before the obstacle fully understood what it was. The second confrontation between Clara and Ethan happened on a Friday evening, and it was nothing like the first. The first had been businesslike. This one was personal. Ethan came in from the North Range an hour later than usual, covered in trail dust and moving like a man carrying 3 conversations worth of frustration in his body. He went through the kitchen, poured water, drank it, set the cup down. Then he turned. Clara was at the table with the invoices spread in front of her again. He stared at them. "You've been going through the supply accounts," he said, not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "The feed accounts too." "Yes." His jaw was tight. Not angry exactly, but something close to it. The particular tension of a man who feels his territory encroached on, even when the person encroaching is trying to help him. "Those are my ranch accounts," he said. "I run this operation." "I know that," Clara said. She didn't move from the table. She didn't close the invoices. "I'm not trying to run it." "Then what are you trying to do?" Clara looked at him steadily. "I'm trying to show you something I found. You can decide what to do with it." A pause. "Show me," he said. His voice was still controlled, but something had shifted under it. She walked him through it. Everything. The feed price inflation, the comparison to market rates in adjacent counties, the pattern across the lumber and fencing supply accounts. The thread that ran through all of it back toward Gerard Hollis and his known connection to Victor Hayes. Ethan didn't interrupt. He stood beside the table with his arms crossed, reading each invoice. She indicated, his eyes moving with the focused precision of a man who built an empire by understanding numbers quickly and trusting his instincts about what they meant. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You did this research yourself," he said. "Roy helped me get the invoices. The analysis is mine." "How long have you been looking at this?" "2 weeks. Another silence. "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" he asked. "Because 2 weeks ago I had a theory," Clara said. "Tonight I have a pattern. I don't bring people half-finished things." Ethan looked at the table full of papers. He looked at her. Something crossed his face that wasn't quite any emotion she could name. Not gratitude, not admiration, not the complicated male pride of a man whose wife has found what his foreman missed. Something more unguarded than any of those. "Victor Hayes," he said. The name came out flat, certain. "I can't prove his direct involvement yet," Clara said. "But the connection to Hollis is documented, and the timing aligns with his 2 offers on the water rights." "He's trying to squeeze the operation," Ethan said. "Make the numbers look worse, create pressure." "That's what I think. So that when he comes with a 3rd offer, the ranch will look like it needs the sale," Clara said. Ethan pulled out a chair and sat down. He pressed both hands flat on the table, staring at the invoices. "We cancel Hollis," he said. "Immediately. I'll put Roy in touch with the Cheyenne suppliers this week. That stops the bleed, Clara said. But Hayes will try something else. I know that. He looked up at her. What would you do next? The question surprised her. Not because it was unusual, she'd been answering questions like it for weeks, but because of how he asked it. Flat and direct, the way he asked Roy a question. The way you ask someone whose judgment you trust. Clara sat down across from him. I'd go to the other ranchers, she said. Not to complain about Hayes, to ask questions. Find out if anyone else has been dealing with unusual supply price increases or unexpected changes in their accounts. She paused. Because if he's doing this to us, he's likely done it before. And people who've been hurt by the same man tend to remember each other. Ethan studied her. You're thinking about a coalition, he said. I'm thinking about information, she said. A coalition is what you build after you have enough of it. He was quiet for a moment. That's a sophisticated thing to think, he said. I grew up poor, Clara said. Poor people learn early that the only thing they have is information and loyalty. Rich people have money. Everyone else has those two things. If you use them well, they can do everything money can do. Ethan stared at her. It wasn't the first time he'd looked at her and had the unsettling experience of realizing he was looking at someone he hadn't expected. But it was the first time the realization arrived with something that felt almost like recognition. The specific sensation of seeing in another person a quality you've only ever found in yourself. The discipline to wait. The refusal to act on anything less than certainty. The understanding that strength is most powerful when it's quiet. All right, he said. We do it your way. Clara nodded. She reached across the table and began gathering the invoices into order. As she did, her hand passed close to his, not touching, but close enough that both of them were aware of the proximity. Neither of them acknowledged it, but neither of them moved to increase the distance. I'll talk to Holt about the Cheyenne connection, Clara said. He has a contact out there from his previous operation. Good. And I'd like to drive out to the Merriweather Ranch next week. Margaret, she caught herself. The name. Forgive me, I don't know if it's... Margaret was my wife's name, Ethan said. His voice didn't change, but something in the air between them did. I know, Clara said carefully. I should have been more thoughtful. You didn't do anything wrong. He looked at the table. Margaret Whitfield, the woman at the Merriweather Ranch, she's been there 15 years. Her husband Frank ran one of the cleanest cattle operations in the county before he died last spring. She's managing it herself now. Would she talk to me? She'll talk to you, Ethan said. She's a practical woman. She respected my wife. If you go to her directly and tell her why you're asking, she'll give you an honest answer. Then I'll go on Tuesday. I'll tell Roy to drive you. I can drive myself. Ethan looked at her. I know you can, he said. But I'd rather Roy went with you. Hayes has people in this county. I'd rather you weren't alone on the road. Clara was quiet for a moment. It was the first time he had said anything that explicitly acknowledged her safety as something that mattered to him. It was delivered plainly without sentiment, the way Ethan Caldwell delivered everything. But it was there. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat at that table for another hour, going through the invoices again, talking through the sequence of steps, speaking in the shorthand of two people who had discovered they think at roughly the same speed. Clara asked questions. Ethan answered them. Ethan made assessments. Clara refined them. Nobody knocked on the kitchen door. Nobody interrupted. By the time they finished, it was past 9 o'clock, and Mrs. Alcott had long since banked the stove and gone to bed, and the kitchen was lit by a single lamp that threw a warm, limited light over the papers spread between them. Ethan stood and gathered the invoices into a neat stack and set them on the shelf where the ledger lived. I'll have Roy send a letter to Hollis tomorrow, he said. And the Cheyenne supplier. I'll handle it personally. Clara stood. She straightened the lamp wick. Ethan, she said. He stopped. It was the first time she'd used his name. Not Mr. Caldwell. Not a formal address. Just his name said the way you say the name of someone you're speaking to, not someone you're speaking at. He turned. Thank you for listening, she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Just a moment." "Thank you for looking," he said. He walked out. Clara stood alone in the kitchen. She pressed one hand flat on the table, feeling the cool wood under her palm. Outside through the wall, she could hear the ranch, the way it sounded at night. The occasional low sound from the cattle pasture, the creak of the bunkhouse, the wind moving through the open country, the way it moved through everything here, indifferent, enormous, and completely real. She stood there until the lamp began to flicker. Then she turned it down and went to bed. She lay awake for a while in the dark. She thought about the way he'd said thank you for looking. The precision of it. Not thank you for telling me, not thank you for your help. For looking. As though the most significant thing was not what she'd found, but that she had thought to find it. That she'd paid attention. That she'd looked at his ranch, his life, the thing he'd built, and nearly lost to grief, and found it worth protecting. She thought about the way he'd said it. Quietly. Without elaboration. Like a man who said less than he meant and knew it. Clara closed her eyes. She had arrived at Caldwell Ridge 6 weeks ago with one suitcase, a broken latch, and the first genuine statement she'd ever made to a man about what she was, someone who could build something from nothing. She hadn't known then, standing on that train platform with the whole town of Willow Creek watching, whether she'd be able to make good on that. She'd believed it. But believing something and being given the space to prove it were two entirely different things. Ethan Caldwell had not given her the space willingly. He hadn't handed it to her the way a generous man hands a gift. He'd yielded it slowly, the way a man yields something he's been holding so long he forgot it was his, to give recognition. Trust, the simple willingness to be surprised by someone he'd underestimated. She thought, I am not done here. I have barely started. She thought Victor Hayes has no idea who he's dealing with. She was right on both counts. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't know. Lying in the dark in that wide, quiet ranch house, her hand still faintly warm from where it had nearly touched Ethan's, across a table full of invoices, was how fast the next move was coming. Hayes had been watching, and watching men in Clara's experience tended to act the moment they felt the thing they wanted slipping away. She was asleep before midnight. Outside Caldwell Ridge breathed in the dark. All 12,000 acres of it, waiting. Roy drove Clara to the Merriweather Ranch on a Tuesday morning, and they were halfway there when they found the fence. Not a broken fence. Not a fence that had fallen from age or weather. A fence that had been deliberately cut, 3 strands of barbed wire clean at the posts recently done, and through the gap. 43 head of Caldwell Ridge cattle had wandered into the adjacent dry gulch, where a section of creek bed had been partially dammed with stones and brush. Clara saw it before Roy did. "Stop the wagon," she said. Roy pulled up. He looked where she was looking. His face changed. "That's our cattle," he said. "Yes." Clara was already climbing down. "And that dam didn't build itself." She walked to the fence line and crouched beside the nearest post. The wire had been cut with something sharp and deliberate, not snapped under pressure, not rusted through. Cut. The ends were clean. She touched them with her fingers. The metal was bright and fresh. "This was done last night," she said. Roy stood beside her, hat in hand, reading the same evidence she was reading. His jaw was tight. "If those cattle drink from that blocked section, the water's standing still. In this heat, that's a health risk," Clara finished. "At minimum. At worst, you lose animals." She stood. "How many head do we have in the eastern pasture right now?" "Closer to 300. Clara looked at the gap in the fence. "Go back to the ranch," she said. "Get Holt and 2 of the hands. Move all the eastern pasture cattle to the northern range until we can assess the full fence line." "That'll take most of the day." "I know. Go." "What about you?" "I'll keep going to the Merriweather place. I need to talk to Margaret Whitfield today. This," she gestured at the fence, at the dam, at the whole deliberate mess of it, "is exactly why." Roy hesitated. "I don't like leaving you on the road alone." "I'll be fine," Clara said. "It's 2 miles. The road is open. And Roy," she waited until he looked at her, "don't tell Ethan yet. Not until I'm back and we have more information. He'll ride straight to Hayes's operation, and that's not what we need right now." Roy studied her. He's going to be angry, Roy said. Both that this happened and that you didn't tell him first. He can be angry at me tonight, Clara said. Right now I need you to move the cattle. Roy put his hat on. He turned the wagon. He drove. Clara walked the remaining 2 miles to the Merriweather Ranch. She arrived dusty and direct, knocked on the front door, and introduced herself to Margaret Whitfield. With the same plain simplicity, she introduced herself to everyone. Her name, her connection to Caldwell Ridge, and the reason she'd come. Margaret Whitfield was 63 years old with white hair. She wore pinned close to her head, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to stop being surprised by most of it. She took one long look at Clara on her doorstep and said, "You'd better come in." Over coffee, Clara asked her questions. She didn't lead with accusations. She didn't mention Hayes by name immediately. She asked about supply costs, about whether Margaret had noticed any changes in vendor pricing over the past year, about the Eastern water rights, and what she knew of their history. Margaret answered each question with the bluntness of a woman managing a cattle operation alone and having no patience for anything that wasn't useful. "Gerard Hollis raised my lumber costs 35% 8 months ago," Margaret said. "I switched suppliers. Hollis sent a man out here to tell me that was a mistake." Clara set her cup down. "What kind of man?" "The polite kind," Margaret said, and her tone made clear that politeness was the most threatening variety. "He sat right where you're sitting. He said something about how isolated operations in this county sometimes found their supply lines difficult to maintain without reliable relationships with established vendors." She paused. "He said it like a suggestion. It felt like something else." "It was something else," Clara said. Margaret looked at her. "You know who sent him?" "I believe so. Victor Hayes," Margaret said flatly. The name sat between them. "Frank, my husband, he had a theory about Hayes," Margaret continued. "He said Hayes didn't want the land. He wanted the water. All of it. The entire Eastern Creek system. If he controls the water rights from the Merriweather boundary down through Caldwell Ridge to the South Fork, he controls where 5 major cattle operations can summer their herds." She looked at her coffee cup. "Frank told Ethan this 2 years ago." Clara was very still. "What did Ethan say?" "Ethan thanked him, said he'd look into it." Margaret's voice carried no bitterness, just the factual record of how things had gone. "And then Frank died that winter, and I think everything Frank had told him got buried under the grief. Ethan stopped paying attention to things outside his own operation for a long while." Clara felt something move through her that wasn't quite anger. It was closer to grief. The grief of understanding how loss could make a sharp man go blind in exactly the places he needed to see clearly. "He's paying attention now," Clara said. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," Margaret said slowly. "I imagine he is." Clara rode back to Caldwell Ridge in a borrowed wagon that Margaret insisted on lending her, with 2 pages of notes she'd written while Margaret talked, and a document that Margaret had produced from a locked box in her desk. A letter Frank Whitfield had written to the Territorial Land Office 14 months before his death, outlining his concerns about Hayes's pattern of acquisition across the eastern county. The letter had never been sent. Frank had meant to revise it. He'd died before he could. Margaret had placed it in Clara's hands with the particular deliberateness of a woman who had been waiting for someone to give it to. "Do something with it," Margaret said. "Frank spent 6 months writing that. It shouldn't stay in a box." Clara drove back holding that letter against her side like something breakable. She was halfway home when she saw the rider coming toward her from the direction of Caldwell Ridge, moving fast, and she knew before she could make out his face that it was Ethan. She pulled the wagon to a stop. He pulled his horse up beside her. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something they rarely did, moving with a specific urgent energy that she understood immediately was not anger. It was fear. Very briefly, very quickly suppressed. But she caught it. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right," she said. He looked at her for a moment, then his jaw set. "Roy told me about the fence. I've been—" He stopped, reorganized. "I've been riding this road for 40 minutes. I told Roy not to tell you until I was back. I know what you told Roy. And Roy told you anyway." Roy has worked for me for 16 years, Ethan said. He knew I'd want to know. Clara looked at him. The letter was still pressed against her side. Are the cattle moved? Yes. Holt has them on the North Range. The fence line is being checked now. We found 2 more cuts further east. His voice was steady, but underneath it was the restrained fury of a man whose property has been violated and whose instinct is to ride toward the problem. I know it was Hayes. I know it was Hayes too, Clara said. But knowing it isn't enough. Clara. The use of her name deliberate now the same way she'd used his 2 weeks ago. He's escalating. First the supply accounts. Now the fence line and the water. I know. This isn't a business dispute anymore. It's pressure, Clara said. He wants you to react. He wants you to ride over to his operation furious and give him something he can use against you. A confrontation, trespassing. If you lose your temper in front of witnesses, he has a story to tell about Ethan Caldwell being unstable, volatile. And a man who behaves that way sometimes has his operation put under scrutiny at exactly the wrong time. Ethan stared at her. The horse shifted under him. He counted on me doing that, Ethan said slowly. He built this whole week around you doing that, Clara said. A long silence passed between them on the empty road. What did Margaret Whitfield tell you? He asked. A great deal. Clara held out the letter. And she gave me this. He took it. Read the first page. His expression shifted not dramatically, not with visible emotion, but the way the expression of a controlled man shifts when he realizes how long and how precisely he's been played. Frank wrote this 14 months ago, he said, and never sent it. Margaret kept it. Frank told me about Hayes's water acquisition theory. I heard him. Ethan folded the letter carefully and held it. I just wasn't thinking clearly at the time. It was the most direct thing he'd ever said about the period after Margaret's death, and they both understood what it meant. Clara didn't fill the space around it with sympathy or acknowledgement. She let it be what it was, an admission, an honesty, and treated it with the respect of silence. You're thinking clearly now, she said. I am. He looked up from the letter. What do we do with this? We take it to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne, Clara said, along with the supply account documentation, and we ask Margaret Whitfield to write a second letter, one she actually sends this time about what happened with Hollis's man, and we talk to the other ranchers, the ones Hayes has pressured. That takes time, Ethan said. Yes. Hayes won't wait. No, Clara said. He won't, which means we need to move faster than he expects. She looked at him. And we need him to keep thinking you're about to ride over there and lose your temper. If he thinks he has you reactive, he won't look at what we're actually doing. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You want me to do nothing, he said. Not with resentment, confirming. I want you to look like you're doing nothing, Clara said. There's a difference. He looked at her on that borrowed wagon with Frank Whitfield's unsent letter in his hand and his cattle safe on the North Range because his wife had made a clear decision and executed it before he even knew the problem existed. He thought of the train platform 7 weeks ago, the woman he'd dismissed in 4 words. He thought, I am an idiot. He didn't say that. What he said was, all right, Clara said. Now can we please go home? I've been walking and riding all day, and Mrs. Alcott made something with venison this morning that I've been thinking about for 3 hours. Ethan turned his horse. For the first time since she'd known him, something crossed his face that she could only call in the most restrained Ethan Caldwell definition of the word amusement. Venison stew, he said. She makes it twice a month. It's extraordinary, Clara said. I know, he said. She made it for Margaret every... He stopped. Clara looked straight ahead at the road. She makes it for everyone, he said quieter. Yes, Clara said gently. She does. They rode home side by side, his horse keeping pace with the borrowed wagon without being directed to, and neither of them spoke again until they reached the gate of Caldwell Ridge. But the silence between them on that road home was a different kind of silence than the one that had ridden with them on the first wagon trip from the train station 7 weeks ago. That silence had been the silence of 2 strangers. This one was something else. The silence of two people who were beginning to trust the same things. The ranch was waiting for them. The trouble that came 3 days later was not from the fence line or the supply accounts or anything Clara had anticipated when she laid out her careful plan. It came from town. It came in the form of Eleanor Whitmore, the woman from the boardwalk outside Farley's General Store, who had apparently decided that whispering about Clara on the boardwalk was no longer sufficient expression of her opinions. Eleanor Whitmore was the wife of Judge Arthur Whitmore, who sat on the county bench and had social connections across the territory that ran deep and wide. She was also, as Clara discovered very quickly, the woman Victor Hayes had been cultivating socially for the better part of 2 years. The story. Eleanor began telling at the Ladies' Church Auxiliary, at the Thursday afternoon social, at every table in Willow Creek, where women gathered and opinions spread, was this, that Clara Bennett was not who she claimed to be. That she had misrepresented her background in the marriage arrangement. That there were questions about her character, her past, and whether Ethan Caldwell had been in essence deceived. Clara heard about it from Mrs. Alcott, who heard it from the delivery boy, who heard it from his mother. She sat with the information for exactly 10 minutes. Then she went to find Ethan. He was in the barn with Jake Mercer checking the conditioning of the summer horses. Clara walked in directly, waited for a natural pause in what they were doing, and said, "I need a few minutes." Jake Mercer read the room and left without being asked. "Eleanor Whitmore is spreading a story about my past," Clara said. "She's implying I deceived you in the marriage arrangement. She's doing it at socials and church functions. By the end of the week, it'll be in every conversation in this county." Ethan's expression didn't change. Not visibly. "Is any of it true?" Clara looked at him straight. "No." "Then I'm not concerned," he said. "You should be," Clara said. "Not about me, about Hayes. Eleanor Whitmore is Judge Whitmore's wife. If Hayes has a legal strategy to challenge our water rights or contest any filing we make at the land office, he needs the judge on his side. And the easiest way to manage a judge is to manage his wife's opinion of the people involved." She paused. "This isn't gossip. This is preparation." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "He's setting up the legal ground," Ethan said. "He's setting up the legal ground," Clara confirmed. "If the judge believes going in that I'm a fraud who deceived his way into this marriage, that any documents I've produced or information I've gathered could be questioned as coming from a compromised source, then anything we bring to the land office or a territorial court is already tainted before we start." Jake Mercer's voice came from outside the barn door, talking to one of the hands oblivious. Inside, the two of them stood with the full weight of what Clara had just said settling between them. "He planned this from the beginning," Ethan said. Not to question. Recognizing. "He planned several moves ahead," Clara said. "The supply accounts were financial pressure. The fence was operational pressure. And this," she gestured, meaning the gossip, the social campaign. "Eleanor Whitmore's mouth. This is reputational pressure. He's hitting every front at once." "Because he's losing patience," Ethan said. "Because something told him time was running out," Clara said. "Which means he knows we've started moving." A cold beat of silence. "Someone told him," Ethan said. "Or he's watching closely enough that he noticed Hollis lost our account," Clara said. "Either way, he knows we're not standing still anymore." Ethan pressed his hand against the nearest stall post. He breathed once slowly. "We need to move faster than we planned," he said. "Yes, but we need one more thing first." Clara met his eyes. "I need to go to the church auxiliary." Ethan stared at her. "You want to walk into the room where Eleanor Whitmore is running a campaign against you," he said. "I want to walk into the room where the women of this county form their opinions," Clara said. "Yes. That's—" He stopped. He started again. "That takes considerable courage." "It takes good timing," Clara said. "There's a difference." Something moved briefly across her face, not fear, but the acknowledgement that what she was about to do was not small. "Will you trust me on this?" Ethan looked at her. In 7 weeks, she had found $50 a month in household savings, identified a systematic financial scheme against his operation, secured a critical piece of documentary evidence from a neighboring ranch, and protected his cattle from a sabotaged water supply without losing a single head. She'd done every one of those things quietly, without credit, without drama, and without once being wrong about what mattered. "Yes," he said. The word came out without hesitation. Clara went to the church auxiliary on Thursday afternoon. She walked in wearing her cleanest dress, still simple, still practical, but pressed and neat, and she carried with her a jar of preserved peaches she and Mrs. Alcott had put up that morning, because you brought something when you came to a gathering of this kind. The room went quiet when she entered. Eleanor Whitmore was sitting at the far end of the main table, and her expression when she saw Clara arrive was the expression of a woman who has rehearsed for a scene and finds the scene has changed. Clara set the peaches on the offering table by the door and said to the nearest woman, a rancher's wife named Helen, who had kind eyes and a bewildered look, "It smells wonderful in here. Is that cinnamon cake?" "It is," Helen said, surprised into naturalness. "I'd love the recipe," Clara said. She worked the room the way she worked everything, not performing, not pushing, but genuinely present. She asked questions. She listened to answers. She remembered names from previous mentions and used them, which was the kind of thing people always noticed without knowing they'd noticed it. She made it 20 minutes before Eleanor Whitmore spoke to her directly. "Mrs. Caldwell," Eleanor said from across the table, in the tone of a woman who had decided to make something happen. "We've been hearing some concerning things. About your arrangement with Mr. Caldwell. About what you represented yourself as." Every conversation in the room stopped. Clara turned to face Eleanor Whitmore completely calm. The calmness of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has decided what it will look like. "What have you heard?" Clara asked, pleasantly, as though genuinely curious. Eleanor blinked. She'd expected defensiveness, denial, distress. She'd prepared for those. "There are questions about your past, your background." "Ask them," Clara said. "I'm right here." A pause. "People are saying you misrepresented yourself," Eleanor said, less certain now. "To whom? Ethan Caldwell." Clara smiled slightly. "I think if Ethan Caldwell felt misrepresented, he's capable of saying so. He's not a man who has trouble speaking his mind. Has he said something to your husband?" Eleanor's composure slipped fractionally. "We're simply concerned," Eleanor said. "About what?" Clara said. "About whether I belong here." She looked around the room at the women watching, at the plain, honest faces of ranchers' wives and shop owners' wives and working women who had made their lives in this hard country the same way she was making hers. "I arrived in Willow Creek 7 weeks ago with one suitcase. The whole town was watching. Mr. Caldwell said 4 words to me that were not welcoming. I could have left. I chose to stay." She looked back at Eleanor. "I stayed because this ranch, these people are worth staying for. I have not lied to anyone. I have not taken anything that wasn't offered. What I have done is work. Every day. The same way every woman in this room works." She paused. "If that's the concern, then yes. I'm guilty of it." The room was very still. Helen, the rancher's wife with the kind eyes, spoke first. "I heard you've been to see Margaret Whitfield," Helen said. "I have," Clara said. "She's a remarkable woman." "She is," Helen said. "Frank would have liked you." She looked around the table with the mild authority of someone who had been attending this auxiliary for 20 years and outranked Eleanor Whitmore in every category that actually mattered. "I think we should have some of that cinnamon cake." The tension in the room broke like a wave. Eleanor Whitmore said nothing else, but she watched Clara for the rest of the afternoon with the expression of a woman recalculating something she'd been very sure about. Clara drove home that evening with 2 recipes, an invitation to a quilting circle, and the certain knowledge that Eleanor Whitmore would be on the telephone to Victor Hayes within the hour. Let her call, Clara thought. Let him hear that it didn't work. Because if Victor Hayes heard that his social campaign had failed, if he heard it fast before they were ready, he would do what pressured men who think they're losing always do. He would make a mistake. Clara was counting on it. What she didn't count on was who delivered the mistake, or how fast, or how personally it would arrive. She was halfway up the porch steps of the main house when Roy came out of the barn at a pace that told her something had happened. His face was the face of a man carrying news that couldn't wait. "We have a problem," he said. Clara stopped on the steps. "Bigger than the fence?" she asked. Roy took off his hat. "Hayes filed a claim with the Territorial Land Office this afternoon," he said. "A formal challenge to Caldwell Ridge's eastern water rights. He's asserting that the original boundary survey from 1871 placed the creek inside territory that was disputed and that the Caldwell claim was improperly filed." Clara gripped the porch railing. "That's not true," she said. "We know it's not true," Roy said. "But he's filed it, which means it goes before a hearing, and the hearing," he paused, "is assigned to Judge Arthur Whitmore." The whole thing snapped into focus all at once with the cold clarity of a plan that had been running beneath the surface for months while they'd been chasing the parts they could see. The supply accounts, the fence, Eleanor Whitmore's social campaign. All of it had been preparation for this. Not pressure tactics. Evidence of character. Ways to make Ethan look reactive, Clara look questionable, and Caldwell Ridge look vulnerable. All before the case that would actually decide everything went before the one judge in the county that Hayes controlled. Clara stood on the porch steps. She breathed once. "When is the hearing?" she said. 3 weeks, Roy said. She looked at him. "Get me the original 1871 survey records," she said. "Everything in the ranch files, tonight." Roy nodded. "And Roy." She waited. "Tell Ethan. Tell him everything. Right now." She paused. "It's time." Roy went to find him. Clara walked into the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood surface, the way she always did when she needed to feel something solid beneath her. 3 weeks. 37 days of careful patient building. The invoices. The letter. Margaret's testimony. The auxiliary. All of it. And Hayes had just raised the stakes past anything she'd planned for. She looked at the kitchen around her. At the space that had gone from cold and efficient to warm and alive. At the chair where Thomas Reed had never sat before she arrived. At the shelf where the corrected ledger sat like proof of something. At the doorway, Ethan had stood in the night she'd shown him the invoices when he'd said thank you for looking with the particular honesty of a man who meant more than he said. She thought, "This is my ranch." She thought, "No one is taking it." The door opened. Ethan walked in. He had already heard some of it from Roy. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the controlled tension of a man who has received bad news and is managing it. He stopped across the table from her. "Whitmore," he said. "Whitmore," she confirmed. "He's had this planned since before you arrived," Ethan said. "Since before you rejected his second offer on the water rights," Clara said. "He just needed us distracted long enough to complete the setup." Ethan sat down across from her. He put both hands on the table the same way she had, mirroring her without realizing it. They looked at each other across that table. "We have 3 weeks," he said. "We have 3 weeks," she said. Frank Whitfield's letter, the supply account records, Margaret's testimony, and whatever is in that 1871 survey. If the survey supports the original filing, then Hayes's entire challenge falls apart, Clara said. He's built his case on the claim that the boundary was disputed. If the original survey is clean, his filing has no foundation. "Where would those records be?" Ethan asked. Clara was already thinking. "The ranch files first. If it's not there, the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. And if the original surveyor's record was registered, the Federal Land Office." "That's a 2-day ride." "I know." Ethan looked at her. "Clara," he said. And in his voice was something she hadn't heard from him before. Not the controlled businessman, not the careful rancher, not the man who delivered difficult truths plainly. Something older than all of those. Something that had been quiet for a very long time. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I said at the station, the first day. I'm sorry it took me this long to say it." The kitchen was absolutely still. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't know me," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." "And now?" she asked. He held her gaze. "Now," he said quietly, "I think you might be the most capable person I've ever met." It was not a love declaration. It was not soft or poetic or anything a woman in a different story might have wanted. It was exactly what Ethan Caldwell was, direct and certain, and entirely true. And it moved through Clara, the way the Wyoming wind moved through everything, indifferent to barriers, enormous, and completely real. "Then let's get to work," she said. She reached for the pen. He reached for the ledger. They had 3 weeks to save everything. The ranch files did not have the 1871 survey. Clara found this out at 11 o'clock at night, 3 hours after Ethan had gone through every drawer, every box, every folded paper in the office, with the systematic thoroughness of a man who knew exactly where he kept things, and was discovering that the one thing he needed most was not there. He stood in the middle of the office with his hands at his sides. "My father filed the original claim," he said. "He would have kept the survey record here. He kept everything here." "Could it have been moved?" Clara asked. "By who?" "Anyone who had access to this office in the past 2 years." She paused. "Anyone who knew it would matter." Ethan looked at her. The implication landed the way it was meant to, not like a suspicion thrown carelessly, but like a door opening onto a room neither of them wanted to enter. "You think Hayes took it," he said. "I think Hayes knew he needed it gone before he filed," Clara said. "If the original survey record is in your files when this case goes to hearing, his challenge has nothing to stand on. Without it, he forces you to reconstruct the evidence from scratch." She looked around the office, the shelves, the drawers, the space where that document should have been. Who's had access to this room in the last year? Roy, Holt, Jake occasionally. Ethan's jaw tightened. And the man Hayes sent to discuss the second offer on the water rights. He came here to the house. I met with him in this office. Clara was very still. "When was that?" she asked. 8 months ago." "And you left him alone in here at any point?" Ethan pressed his lips together. He was a man who did not enjoy realizing he'd been outmaneuvered. "I stepped out. 5 minutes, maybe less. He asked to use the washroom. 5 minutes was all it took." Clara breathed once. "Then the Cheyenne Land Office is our first move. If the original surveyor registered a copy of his work with the Territorial Office, and most of them did, it was standard practice. Then Hayes can remove the document from your files, but he can't touch the official record." 2 days to Cheyenne and back," Ethan said. "That leaves us 20 days before the hearing. Then we leave tomorrow morning." Clara said it the way she said everything, not asking, not suggesting, simply stating the logical next action. Ethan looked at her. "We," he said. "You need someone to manage the document search while you talk to the land office administrator. That's 2 conversations happening at the same time." She met his eyes. "Unless you want to send Roy." He didn't want to send Roy. "We leave at dawn," he said. They left at dawn. Mrs. Alcott pressed food on them before they went. Thomas Reed held the horses. Luke Harper checked the wagon wheels without being asked. Samuel Carter, who had been eating full meals and sleeping through the night for the past 3 weeks, and whose face had gradually returned from blankness to something that resembled the man Roy said he used to be. Samuel came out and stood by the gate and said, "Bring it back, Mrs. Caldwell." Not bring back the document. Not win the case. Bring it back, as though Caldwell Ridge itself was what she was carrying. Clara looked at him from the wagon. "I intend to," she said. The road to Cheyenne was long, and the first hours passed mostly in silence, the easy silence of 2 people who had stopped filling quiet with words. They had been in each other's company long enough now that silence was no longer something to manage. It was simply the space between conversations. An hour out, Ethan said, "Tell me about Indiana." Clara glanced at him. "What do you want to know?" "Whatever you want to say." It was a deliberately open invitation, and from Ethan Caldwell. It was the equivalent of a long, warm speech from anyone else. Clara looked at the road ahead. "We had a farm," she said. "Not large. My father worked it and my mother kept everything running. When I was 12, we had a bad winter. 3 animals died. The north field flooded in spring, and we nearly lost the property." She paused. "My mother didn't cry once. She reorganized everything. She renegotiated a debt with the bank by showing up in person with 2 years of ledger records and a proposal for a repayment schedule. The banker tried to dismiss her. She sat in his office for 4 hours until he read what she'd brought him. Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Did it work?" "We kept the farm," Clara said. "My father used to say she won that bank the same way she won everything, by outlasting every person in the room who wanted her to give up." Ethan absorbed that. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," he said. "She would have liked you," Clara said. She respected men who said what they meant. Something moved through Ethan's expression. Not quite a smile. Something quieter and more real. She would have had limited material to work with. Clara looked at him sideways. "You say what you mean." "I say very little." "What you say is true," she said. She considered that sufficient. They drove another mile before he said, "My father was the same. 30 words when 20 would do was considered extravagant in this family." Clara laughed. An actual genuine laugh, unguarded and short and real. Ethan glanced at her when she laughed, the way a person looks at something unexpected that turned out to be good. "Margaret," he began, and this time the name came out differently than it had before, less weighted. "My wife. She used to say that conversation in this house was conducted by semaphore. You had to learn the signals." He was quiet for a moment. "She was very good at reading people. She would have read you immediately." "What would she have thought?" Clara asked. He considered that with genuine seriousness. "She would have been relieved," he said finally. "She worried toward the end about the ranch, about me. She knew I had a tendency to close down. She didn't think I'd manage well alone." "Were you alone long?" Clara asked. 3 years, he said. "Before I wrote to the agency." "What made you do it then?" Ethan's hands moved on the reins. "Thomas Reed told me the kitchen table had been set for one so long that the other chairs had forgotten what they were for," he said. He said it like it was an observation about furniture. "I spent a week thinking about it before I admitted it was about me." Clara was quiet. "Thomas Reed," she said softly. "That man carries more wisdom than he lets on." "He always has," Ethan said. "I stopped listening about 2 years ago. You started listening within a week of arriving." He paused. "I noticed that." "I know you did," Clara said. He glanced at her. "You saw me watching." "The morning by the bunkhouse," she said. "You walked away before Thomas looked up. But I heard you stop." A beat of silence. "I didn't expect you to notice that," he said. "I notice most things," Clara said. "I know," Ethan said. "I've spent 9 weeks discovering exactly how much you notice." The wagon moved through the open country. The sky was enormous above them. Neither of them spoke for another mile, but the silence between them had changed again, had deepened into something that was less the absence of words and more the presence of an understanding that didn't need them. They were not the same people who had stood on that train platform 9 weeks ago. Something had been built in the space between them quietly and without ceremony. The way good things are built out of work and honesty and the daily choice to stay. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne was a bureaucratic institution staffed by men who dealt in paper and precedent, and Clara had prepared herself for delay, for obstruction, for the particular exhaustion of navigating systems designed by people who wanted them difficult. What she had not prepared for was Robert Whitson. Robert Whitson was the senior land records administrator, 60 years old, with ink-stained fingers and a meticulous filing system he had maintained personally for 22 years. He was also, it turned out, a man who had a very specific opinion about Victor Hayes. He formed this opinion. He explained to Clara while Ethan spoke with the deputy administrator in the adjacent room 4 years ago, when Hayes had attempted to challenge a small operations land filing in the northern county, and someone in this very office had misfiled 3 critical documents for 6 days, long enough to delay the ruling past the deadline. The small operation lost their claim, Whitson said. They were a family of 4 who'd worked that land for 8 years. The father came in here and stood at that counter and I couldn't tell him anything. His voice was even, but his eyes were not. I've been very careful about what I keep and where I keep it since then. Clara looked at him. Do you have the original survey for the Caldwell Ridge eastern boundary, filed under the 1871 territorial land claim? Whitson looked at her for a long moment. He stood up from his desk. Come with me, he said. He led her to the back record room shelves of bound volumes, organized by year and county and claim number. He went directly without hesitation to the 1871 Wyoming Territory section, ran his finger along the spines, pulled a bound volume, opened it to a page with practiced efficiency, and pointed. There it was. The original survey. The boundary lines. The creek designation. The surveyor's signature and official registration stamp. Clara pressed her finger to the page and held it there for a moment, the way you hold something you weren't sure you'd find. "Can we get a certified copy?" she asked. "I can have it ready in an hour," Whitson said. He paused. "Mrs. Caldwell, the hearing is before Judge Whitmore." "Yes." Whitson was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that meant something. "Judge Whitmore is a precise man," he said carefully. "He rules on evidence. He doesn't allow personal relationships to influence his rulings as a matter of professional pride." Another pause. "His wife's opinions are his wife's opinions. They are not his." Clara looked at him. "You're telling me Hayes miscalculated with the judge," she said. "I'm telling you that a man who built his career on the reputation of impartiality tends to guard that reputation above most other things." Whitson closed the volume carefully. "Especially when he's aware that someone is attempting to use his wife to create an impression of bias." He looked at her steadily. "Arthur Whitmore is not a fool, and he doesn't like being managed." Clara absorbed this. "Who told him?" she asked. "Someone who has watched Hayes operate in this territory for a long time," Whitson said, "and who submitted a formal letter to the judge's clerk this morning, detailing the pattern of Hayes's legal manipulation in the Northern County case 4 years ago." Clara stared at him. "You filed that letter," she said. "I filed it in my official capacity as Senior Land Records Administrator, yes," Whitson said. He picked up the volume and turned back toward the shelves. "I'll have your certified copy ready in 1 hour." He walked away. Clara stood alone in the record room for a moment. Then she walked back to find Ethan. I was finishing with the deputy administrator, who was explaining some point about the filing timeline, and he looked up when Clara came in. He read her face immediately. He'd learned to read her face in the same weeks she'd learned to read his, and something in his own expression shifted. "You found it," he said. "We found it," she said. "And something else." She told him about Whitson, about the letter, about what the judge apparently knew. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "Hayes built his whole strategy on controlling the judge through Eleanor," he said. "And the judge found out," Clara said, "which means Hayes doesn't know his most important piece has been removed. He's going to walk into that hearing in 3 weeks confident he has the outcome managed." "And he won't," Ethan said. "He won't," Clara confirmed. "But we still have to make the case. The certified survey alone establishes the boundary. Combined with Frank Whitfield's letter, the supply account evidence, and Margaret's testimony about Hollis's man. It's not just a defense," Ethan said. "It's a counterclaim." "Yes," Clara said. "We're not walking in there to protect ourselves. We're walking in there to expose a pattern." Ethan looked at her. "Clara," he said, "Hayes has real legal representation, a territorial attorney from Laramie." "I know. We need someone in that room who knows how to present this evidence correctly. Someone who understands territorial land law." "I know that too," Clara said. Margaret Whitfield mentioned a name, an attorney in Cheyenne who handled her husband's original land filings and who has experience with water rights cases. She said Frank trusted him completely. "Did she give you a way to contact him?" Clara reached into her coat pocket and produced a folded piece of paper. "His office address. She gave it to me when I visited her." Ethan looked at the paper, looked at her. "You planned for this," he said. "I planned for needing an attorney," she said. "I didn't know it would be in Cheyenne, but I kept the address." He shook his head very slightly. The motion of a man repeatedly encountering evidence that he underestimated someone and finding the evidence each time both humbling and remarkable. "Let's go find him," he said. The attorney's name was Daniel Reeves, and he was 55 years old and had spent 30 of those years working territorial land law in Wyoming, with the dogged persistence of a man who considered the law itself worth protecting from the people who tried to bend it. He listened to everything. Clara and Ethan presented, asked 23 sharp questions. Clara counted and then sat back in his chair and said, "Hayes made a critical error." "Which one?" Ethan said. "He filed the challenge in the county court rather than the territorial court," Reeves said. "He did that deliberately. He wanted Whitmore. But it means the case is subject to county filing rules, which require a response from your side within 10 days of the original filing to request evidence discovery." Clara and Ethan looked at each other. "That deadline is," Ethan began. "4 days from now," Reeves said. "Which is why it's fortunate you're sitting in my office today rather than next week." He looked at the certified survey copy. "With this, and with what you've described from Whitfield's letter, and the supply account documentation, I can file a response that doesn't just defend your water rights, it formally challenges the legitimacy of Hayes's claim and requests a full evidentiary hearing." "Can we win?" Ethan asked. Reeves considered the question without rushing it. "The survey evidence is definitive on the boundary question," he said. "The pattern of financial manipulation. Hollis the fence, the document removal from your files, that's harder to prove in 3 weeks." He paused. "But it doesn't need to be proven beyond doubt in the hearing. It needs to be credible enough that the judge takes it seriously. And given what I understand about Whitmore's current state of mind, he'll want to establish that he cannot be influenced," Clara said. Reeves looked at her with a new level of attention. "Correct. Which means he'll rule on evidence with unusual strictness. Hayes's challenge has to stand entirely on its own legal merit, and without the survey dispute." "It has none," Clara said. "It has very little," Reeves said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Caldwell, did you work in law?" "No," Clara said. "You think like someone who did." "My mother taught me to read contracts before I could ride a horse," Clara said. "She said the most important skill a woman could have was knowing exactly what she'd agreed to." Reeves smiled. It was the smile of a man who rarely smiled, but meant it when he did. "She was right." He picked up his pen. "I'll begin the response filing tonight. I'll need you both here tomorrow to sign. And I'll need the Whitfield letter and copies of the supply account documentation." "We have them," Clara said. "Then go find a hotel," Reeves said. "Eat something. Sleep if you can." He looked at Ethan. "Your wife has been carrying a considerable amount, Mr. Caldwell. Let her rest." Ethan looked at Clara. She was already thinking about the documents she needed to organize. He could see it, the particular focused cast of her attention, that meant her mind was already 3 steps ahead of the current moment. "Clara," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Let's eat something," he said. She blinked, came back from wherever her mind had been. "Yes," she said. "All right." They found a small restaurant 2 streets from the land office, and they sat across from each other at a table that was nothing like the kitchen table at Caldwell Ridge, but felt somehow in the particular comfort of being opposite each other after a long day, like an extension of it. Ethan ordered without looking at the menu. Clara ordered something she'd never had before because it was on the board, and she decided she wanted to try it. And when it arrived and turned out to be nothing like she'd imagined, she said so plainly, and Ethan looked at her plate and said, "I could have warned you about that." And Clara said, "You could have told me you knew the menu." And he said, "I come here twice a year for land office business." And she said, "That's information I could have used 5 minutes ago." And he looked at her with that particular quiet, almost amusement that was the closest Ethan Caldwell got to laughing in public. It lasted 30 seconds at most. It was the most ordinary moment they'd ever shared, and Clara felt it land in her chest like something permanent. They got back to Caldwell Ridge on the evening of the second day, to find Roy waiting with his hat in his hands and 2 pieces of news. The first piece of news was good. Margaret Whitfield had arrived that afternoon with a written statement from 3 other ranchers in the eastern county who had experienced similar supply price manipulation tied to Hollis, and she had driven herself over in her own wagon and was currently sitting in the kitchen with Mrs. Alcott like someone who had decided she lived there. The second piece of news was not good. Hayes had sent a man to the ranch that morning. Not a polite man from 8 months ago. A different one. He'd been turned away at the gate by Holt Dawson, who had told him in terms that Roy described as vivid, that he could take his message and his person and return to wherever he'd come from. But the man had left a letter, addressed to Clara. Roy gave it to her. She opened it on the porch. Ethan standing 2 feet away, not reading over her shoulder, but present enough that she knew she didn't have to face it alone. The letter was from Hayes directly. It was courteous in its language and violent in its intent. It said in the particular prose of a man who has learned to make threats sound like offers that he was aware she had traveled to Cheyenne, that he was aware she had retained legal counsel, that none of this would change the outcome of the hearing, but it did suggest a level of ambition that he found concerning in a woman of her background. He suggested politely, with the grammar of a gentleman, that she encourage her husband to reconsider the third offer on the water rights, which he intended to refile formally after the hearing confirmed his claim. He suggested that Caldwell Ridge would be better managed by someone with deeper roots in Wyoming than a mail-order bride from Indiana who had arrived 9 weeks ago. He suggested she understood what he meant. Clara read it twice. She folded it. She handed it to Ethan. He read it. His face did something she had never seen it do, a brief controlled flash of something that was not temper but was directly adjacent to it, held in check by the same discipline that held everything else in check, but hotter and less contained than anything she'd seen from him before. "He's threatening you," Ethan said. "He's trying to," Clara said. "Clara, he's afraid," she said. "That's what this letter is, not a threat. It's fear wearing a suit." She looked at Ethan steadily. A man who was confident about the outcome of that hearing wouldn't waste time writing this. Ethan looked at the letter in his hand. "He knows something's changed," he said. "He knows we went to Cheyenne," Clara said. "He doesn't know what we found. He doesn't know about Reeves. He doesn't know about Whitson's letter to the judge. He doesn't know about Margaret and the other ranchers." She paused. "He's writing this because he's not sure anymore, and he wants me afraid enough to talk you into taking the offer." "And if he knew you better," Ethan said, "he'd know that was never going to work." It was stated flatly as fact the way Ethan stated things. But what was beneath it? The certainty, the directness, the specific quality of trust in her, that the words carried moved through Clara, the way the venison stew and the long quiet of this ranch had moved through her as things that belonged here and to which she was beginning to belong. "Should we respond?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. He folded the letter and put it in his breast pocket. "We respond in 3 weeks." He opened the front door of the house. Thomas Reed was visible through the kitchen window. Margaret Whitfield's voice could be heard talking to Mrs. Alcott. Roy's boots on the porch steps behind them. Luke's laugh from the direction of the horse barn. Ethan held the door open. Clara walked through it. Inside, Margaret Whitfield looked up from the kitchen table, took in both of their faces and said, "You got the survey." "We got the survey," Clara said. Margaret nodded once with the deep satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting a long time to hear good news. "Frank would be pleased," she said simply. Clara sat down at the table. She looked at the faces around her, Roy and Margaret and Mrs. Alcott, and through the window, Luke at the barn and Thomas by the fire and Samuel at the gate, and she felt something she had no name for, except that it was enormous and quiet, and exactly like what her mother had described. Once the thing that made you keep going even when the ground was uncertain. It was the feeling of not being alone. It was the feeling of mattering to the people who mattered to you. It was the feeling plain and certain and real of being home. 3 weeks, she said to the room. 3 weeks, Roy confirmed. Outside Wyoming was going dark, and inside Caldwell Ridge for the first time in longer than any of them could accurately remember, everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the longest and the shortest of Clara's life. Long because every day carried the particular weight of something enormous, approaching the kind of weight that presses on the chest at 3 in the morning and makes the smallest decisions feel consequential. Short because there was so much work that the days collapsed into each other without ceremony, and she would look up from the kitchen table at midnight, surrounded by documents and notes, and Margaret Whitfield's careful testimony, and discover that another day had passed without her fully living inside it. Daniel Reeves drove out from Cheyenne on the second week to go through the evidence in person. He sat at the kitchen table for 6 hours. He asked questions the way a surgeon asks questions, precise without sentiment, following each answer to its logical end before moving to the next. Clara answered all of them. Ethan answered the ones about operations and finances. Margaret answered the ones about Hollis and the pressure campaign. Roy answered the ones about the fence and the water. At the end of 6 hours, Reeves stacked his papers, looked around the table and said, "Hayes's attorney is good. He'll try to narrow this to a single boundary question and exclude the pattern evidence as irrelevant to the water rights claim." "Can he do that?" Roy asked. "He can try," Reeves said. "It'll be my job to make sure Judge Whitmore understands that the boundary question cannot be understood in isolation from the pattern." He looked at Clara. "Which is why I want you in that courtroom." Clara looked at him. "As a witness," she asked. "As someone who can look at a judge and make him feel the full weight of what's being described," Reeves said. "I'll put Margaret on the stand for the Hollis testimony. I'll put Roy on for the fence. But you—" He paused. "You're the person who saw all of it, who connected it, whose first week on this ranch led to uncovering what 9 years of ranch hands missed." He was direct and unsentimental about it. A jury of 12 would be moved by that. Judge Whitmore is not a jury, but he's a human being, and human beings respond to the truth when it's told by someone who means every word. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You want me to testify about what I found," she said. "I want you to testify about why you looked," Reeves said. "There's a difference." She recognized the echo of her own words from weeks ago when she'd told Ethan the same thing across the kitchen table. "All right," she said. Ethan, sitting beside her, said nothing, but his hand resting on the table moved a fraction of an inch closer to hers. Not touching. Present. Clara felt it the way you feel a fire from across the room. Not the heat exactly, but the knowledge that the heat is there. The night before the hearing, Caldwell Ridge was quiet in a way it almost never was. The Cowboys had come in early from the range. Mrs. Alcott had cooked a meal large enough for twice the people who ate it, because cooking was how she managed the weight of things she couldn't control. Thomas Reed sat by the kitchen fire after dinner and told a story about a case he'd witnessed in a Colorado mining town 20 years ago where a judge had ruled against a claim so powerful that the whole gallery had gone silent for 30 seconds before anyone moved. "What happened to the man who won?" Luke asked. "He went home," Thomas said simply. "That's what winning looks like, son. You go home." The table was quiet. Samuel Carter said, "We go home either way, but it's better when it's still yours when you get there." Nobody disagreed with that. Later, when the house had mostly settled, and Roy had gone to the bunkhouse, and Margaret had retired to the guest room, and Mrs. Alcott had banked the stove for the night, Clara sat alone at the kitchen table with the documents arranged in front of her for the last time, going through them. Once more, the way a person checks a door, they've already locked, not because they doubt it, but because certainty is earned through the willingness to check again. She heard Ethan's step in the hallway before he appeared. He came in, saw her at the table, and sat down across from her without being asked. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "You've read those 40 times," he said. 38, she said. "Clara." She looked up. "We're ready," he said. She held his gaze. "I know." "Then stop reading the documents." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "I keep thinking about what I missed. Whether there's something Hayes has that we haven't anticipated." "There might be," Ethan said. "You can't read your way out of that possibility. It's either there or it's not." She breathed. "I know. We have the survey. We have the pattern. We have Reeves." He paused. "And we have the truth, which is not a small thing." Clara looked at him across the table. This man who had said 4 devastating words to her on a train platform 11 weeks ago, and who had spent every week since then becoming someone she hadn't expected. Not softer, not easier, but more present, more honest, more willing to be surprised by what he found. "Are you afraid?" she asked. He considered the question seriously the way he considered everything. "Yes," he said, "but not about the hearing." She waited. "I'm afraid of what it would cost the people in this house if we lost," he said. "Thomas, Samuel, Luke, Roy." A pause. "Margaret, Mrs. Alcott." Another pause, smaller than the others. You. Clara was very still. Not the land, she said quietly. The land is land, Ethan said. I've loved it my whole life, but land doesn't. He stopped. Started again. When Margaret died, I thought the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing someone they loved. And it was. It was the worst thing. He looked at the table. What I didn't understand until recently was that there was a second worst thing, which was deciding after that it was safer not to love anything that could be lost. The kitchen was absolutely still. Ethan, Clara said. He looked up at her. You're not going to lose us, she said. The word us arrived in the space between them and stayed there. Not a declaration, not a performance. Just the plain truth stated by a woman who didn't say things she didn't mean. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I don't think I am. He reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, not the near touch of weeks of careful proximity, not the fraction of an inch closeness of two people finding their way toward something they didn't have words for yet. His hand over hers. Fully. Certain. Clara turned her hand under his and held it. They sat there in the kitchen of Caldwell Ridge in the quiet, before the most important day either of them had faced in years, and neither of them said another word, because there was nothing left to say that the silence wasn't already saying more completely. The county courthouse in Willow Creek was packed. Clara had not expected that. She'd expected the principals Hayes and his attorney and his witnesses Reeves and their side judge Whitmore on the bench. She had not expected the gallery to be filled to standing capacity with what appeared to be a significant portion of the entire eastern county. She saw Margaret Whitfield in the second row, composed and deliberate. She saw Helen from the church auxiliary sitting with two other women Clara recognized from the Thursday social. She saw Jim Farley from the general store. She saw Frank Morrison, whose operation ran along the northern boundary and who had driven 3 hours to be here. She saw in the back row Thomas Reed, who had not, as far as anyone knew, left Caldwell Ridge Ranch for any reason in 4 years, sitting straight-backed in a clean shirt with his hat on his knee. She stopped when she saw him. He caught her eye from across the room. He nodded once. The nod of a man who has decided this mattered enough to show up for. Clara turned back to the front of the room. She sat down beside Reeves and across the aisle from Hayes's attorney, a lean man named Calloway, who wore his confidence the way expensive men wore expensive clothes, as though it had been tailored specifically for him. Hayes himself sat beside Calloway, with the settled ease of a man who believed the outcome was already decided. He looked at Clara once when she came in. She looked back at him steadily until he looked away first. Judge Arthur Whitmore entered at 9 o'clock precisely. He was 60 years old, thin, with the posture of a man who considered personal discipline a moral position. He surveyed the gallery without expression, looked at both tables with equal neutrality, and called the proceeding to order in a voice that had the quality of finality built directly into it. Calloway opened for Hayes with a smooth, practiced argument that narrowed everything down to a single point. The boundary language in the original 1871 claim was ambiguous. The creek designation had never been formally clarified, and the Caldwell operation had no definitive documentation establishing their water rights over Hayes's competing claim. How was good? Clara had expected him to be good. He spoke for 20 minutes without stumbling once, and by the end of it, the room had the uneasy quiet of people who aren't sure which way the wind is blowing. Then Reeves stood up. He was not a dramatic man. He did not have Calloway's tailored ease or his performer's confidence. He was a man who had spent 30 years believing that the truth presented with absolute precision was the most powerful force in any room. He placed the certified copy of the 1871 survey on the evidence table. He placed Frank Whitfield's letter beside it. He placed the supply account documentation, 6 months of invoices, the market rate comparisons, the Hollis connection beside that. He said, "Your Honor, the opposing counsel has argued that the boundary language is ambiguous. The original survey registered with the Territorial Land Office and certified 2 weeks ago by Senior Administrator Robert Whitson is not ambiguous. The creek designation appears on page 3, line 7, in language that has a single possible interpretation." He opened the document and read it aloud clearly, slowly once. The room was completely silent. Judge Whitmore looked at the document for a long time. Calloway objected to the relevance of the supply account documentation. Reeves argued that it was directly relevant to establishing a pattern of deliberate commercial pressure designed to devalue the Caldwell operation ahead of a forced sale, and that this pattern was inseparable from Hayes's motivation for filing the water rights challenge. Whitmore said, "I'll hear it." Calloway's jaw tightened. It was the first moment Hayes's settled ease shifted. Clara watched it happen from across the aisle, a small, precise recalibration of his posture, the kind that happens when a man realizes the room is not arranged the way he arranged it. Margaret Whitfield testified for 40 minutes. She was exact, unhurried, and devastating. She described Hollis's man arriving at her door. She described the implied threat. She described Frank's letter, and why she'd kept it for 14 months, and what she'd hoped to do with it, and who she'd ultimately given it to. Calloway cross-examined her aggressively, trying to establish that her testimony was hearsay, that she had no direct evidence of Hayes's involvement, that her grief over her husband's death might be coloring her account. Margaret Whitfield looked at him the way a woman looks at a man who has decided she can be rattled. "My husband is dead, Mr. Calloway," she said in a voice that carried without rising. "He spent 6 months writing a letter about exactly this situation, and he died before he could send it. The only thing coloring my account is the wish that he'd lived to deliver it himself." The gallery was silent. Calloway sat down. Then Reeves called Clara. She walked to the stand with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been preparing for this moment without knowing. It was this moment she was preparing for, through every practical decision, every careful action, every choice in 11 weeks to stay when leaving would have been easier. Reeves asked her to describe what she'd found in the supply accounts, and when and how. She described it precisely. She described the methodology, the comparison to market rates, the pattern across multiple account categories, the thread back to Hollis. She described the Cheyenne trip and what Robert Whitson had told her about the Northern County case 4 years ago. Calloway objected to that last item as hearsay. Whitmore sustained it. Reeves moved on without breaking stride. He asked Clara about the fence when she'd found it, what she'd observed, what conclusions she'd drawn, and on what basis. Then he asked the question Clara had known was coming since the night he'd sat at her kitchen table. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "you arrived at Caldwell Ridge 11 weeks ago. You had no prior knowledge of this territory, these operations, or any of the parties involved. What made you start looking?" Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she turned her gaze to Judge Whitmore, because Reeves had told her that when she answered this question, she should speak to the judge. "Because it was my ranch," she said. "I arrived with 1 suitcase, and I was told on the first day that I wasn't what was expected. I understood that. I'm not what most people expect." She paused. "But I know how to pay attention to a place. I know how to listen to people. And when I listened to the people at Caldwell Ridge, the ranch hands, the foreman, the cook, the cowboys who'd been there 20 years, what I heard was a ranch that was being quietly drained, not by mismanagement, not by bad decisions, by design." She held the judge's gaze. "I looked because nobody else was looking. Because my husband was grieving and working and managing 12,000 acres, and he trusted that the world around him was what it appeared to be. Someone needed to check whether it was." The room was very still. Judge Whitmore's expression had not changed from the controlled neutrality he'd maintained all morning. But his eyes, fixed on Clara, were doing something that controlled men's eyes do when they've heard something they recognize as true, sharpening, just slightly, with the particular attention of a person who has been paying careful attention and has just received confirmation of what they suspected. Calloway's cross-examination of Clara was the most aggressive of the morning. He questioned her background. He questioned her qualifications to assess financial documents. He suggested her conclusions about Hayes were speculative and motivated by a desire to protect her own position, that she was a woman who had arrived in this territory under unclear circumstances and had a personal interest in the outcome of this case. Clara answered every question without defensiveness and without performance. "You're correct that I have a personal interest," she said. "This is my home. These are my people. Of course I have an interest in protecting them." She looked at him steadily. "But personal interest and truth are not mutually exclusive, Mr. Calloway. The survey says what it says. The invoices show what they show. The pattern is what it is. None of that changes because of who found it. Calloway had no follow-up. He sat down. And then, the moment nobody in that gallery had anticipated arrived, because Hayes's attorney called one final witness, and that witness was Eleanor Whitmore. The gallery stirred. Clara heard the murmur move through the room like wind through dry grass. At the Caldwell table, Reeves went very still. Clara looked at him. "Did you know?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "He's trying to reintroduce the character question. He's desperate." Eleanor Whitmore took the stand. She was dressed carefully composed and clearly uncomfortable in a way she was working hard not to show. Calloway asked her a series of questions about Clara's reputation in town, about rumors she'd heard about the character concerns she'd expressed at the church auxiliary. Clara watched Eleanor Whitmore from the respondents' table and felt something unexpected, not anger, not anxiety, pity. This was a woman who had been handed a role in someone else's scheme and had played it without understanding the full cost of what she was participating in. And then Judge Whitmore did something. He interrupted Calloway's questioning. "Mr. Calloway," he said in a voice so carefully neutral it was itself a signal, "I want to be very clear about what I am and am not willing to hear in this proceeding." He set down his pen. "This is a water rights hearing. It pertains to documented evidence regarding a boundary survey and the pattern of commercial conduct surrounding this filing. I have no interest in the social reputation of the respondent, as character testimony is not relevant to property documentation." He paused. "I will ask you to confine your examination to matters pertinent to the evidence at hand." Eleanor Whitmore was dismissed from the stand. She walked past the respondent's table to return to the gallery. She did not look at Clara. But when she reached the gallery row, she stopped for one moment, and in that moment, Clara saw her face the full weight of a woman who had said things she wished she hadn't, who had carried someone else's agenda without knowing where it was taking her. Clara held her gaze. She nodded once. Not forgiveness too soon for that, and Clara was not a woman who performed forgiveness she hadn't arrived at yet. But acknowledgement. The acknowledgement of one woman to another, that what had happened between them was not the worst thing either of them would survive. Eleanor Whitmore sat down. Closing arguments took 30 minutes. Reeves was brief, precise, and final. The survey established the boundary. The pattern established the motive. The community of witnesses who had come forward established the scope. Caldwell Ridge's water rights were not ambiguous. They were documented. They were legal. And the challenge before the court was not a legitimate boundary dispute, but a calculated attempt to use the judicial system to accomplish through legal pressure what commercial pressure had failed to achieve. Calloway argued for 20 minutes with the energy of a man rowing against a current he could feel, but hadn't yet admitted was stronger than he was. Judge Whitmore recessed for 1 hour. That hour was the longest of Clara's life. She sat with Ethan in the courthouse corridor. Roy stood against the wall. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap. Thomas Reed, from across the corridor, watched Clara with the steady attention of a man who had seen enough of the world to know that waiting was its own kind of courage. Ethan sat beside Clara close enough that their shoulders touched. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. The contact was enough. When the door opened and the bailiff called them back in, Clara walked into that room with the same steadiness. She'd walked into every room for the past 11 weeks, not because she wasn't afraid, but because fear had never once been a good reason to stop moving. Judge Whitmore settled himself at the bench. He looked at both tables with the impartiality of a man who had made his decision and was at peace with it. In the matter of Hayes versus Caldwell, regarding the Eastern water rights and boundary dispute, he said, this court finds as follows. The gallery was completely silent. The certified survey of 1871, registered with the Territorial Land Office and verified by the Senior Land Records Administrator, establishes the eastern boundary of Caldwell Ridge with clarity that admits no legitimate dispute. The creek designation is unambiguous. The Caldwell water rights are documented legal and predating any competing claim by 14 years. Calloway was very still. Hayes beside him had gone. The particular color of a man receiving news. he'd told himself was impossible. Furthermore, Whitmore continued, this court is compelled to note for the record, and for any subsequent proceedings that may arise, that the pattern of commercial conduct documented in the respondent's evidence raises serious questions about the nature and motivation of this filing. I am formally referring this documentation to the Territorial Attorney General's office for review. The gallery broke open. Not with cheering, this was a courthouse, and Judge Whitmore's presence commanded a certain restraint, but with the particular sound of a large number of people releasing a breath they'd been holding simultaneously, which is its own kind of roar. Roy pressed both hands over his face. Margaret Whitfield closed her eyes. Reeves set his pen down and leaned back in his chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his job. Clara sat completely still for one moment. Then she turned to Ethan. He was looking at her. Not at the judge, not at Hayes, not at the gallery. At her. With the full, unguarded directness of a man who has stopped managing his own face. "We go home," she said. "We go home," he said. What happened outside the courthouse in the next 20 minutes was the kind of thing that doesn't get recorded in any official document, but becomes in a community the thing people tell for years. Margaret Whitfield walked directly to Clara and took both her hands without saying anything for a long moment. When she finally spoke, she said, "Frank would have shaken your hand. That was always his way. But I'm going to do this instead." And she embraced Clara the way a woman embraces someone she's decided to claim as family. Not tentatively, not with the careful distance of new acquaintance, but fully with the certainty of a choice made. Jim Farley from the general store was next. He shook Clara's hand with both of his and said, "That thing you said on the stand, about looking because nobody else was. My wife hasn't stopped talking about it since you said it." He shook his head. "You're good for this county, Mrs. Caldwell." Helen from the church auxiliary appeared beside him. "The recipe I promised you," she said, and pressed a folded piece of paper into Clara's hand. "Cinnamon cake. Don't let the butter fool you. It needs more than you think." One by one, the people came. Frank Morrison, who'd driven 3 hours the ranchers' wives from the auxiliary, Jim's delivery boy, who'd heard about this hearing from his mother and apparently decided it was worth seeing in person. And then Thomas Reed was standing in front of her. He had walked all the way from the back row of the gallery through the crowd without rush, because Thomas Reed had never rushed anything in 70 years and wasn't starting now. He stood in front of Clara, and he looked at her with his old eyes that had seen 3 decades of this country and every kind of person it produced. He said, "I've worked Caldwell Ridge for 20 years. I stayed because I had nowhere better to go. That's the truth." He paused. "But I'm going to stay now because there's nowhere I'd rather be. That's a different thing. You understand the difference?" Clara looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I do." He nodded. He turned and walked back through the crowd. Clara watched him go and felt something move through her that she recognized finally as the thing she'd been building toward since the morning she'd sat down across from this man with a coffee cup and listened to him talk about a horse called Juniper. It wasn't satisfaction exactly. It wasn't victory. It was the feeling of a foundation solid true, built from the right materials by people who chose to be there. She felt Ethan beside her before she turned to look at him. He had been working his way back through the crowd, and now he was there, and the crowd had given them, without quite realizing it, a small circle of space. "Hayes is leaving," he said. He didn't say it with triumph. He said it like a fact. Clara looked. Hayes and Calloway were moving through the courthouse doors without stopping, without looking back. The man who had spent a year arranging the board was leaving the game without acknowledging the loss, which told you everything you needed to know about the kind of man he was. "He'll try something else eventually," Clara said. "Probably," Ethan said. "But not with us. Not here." "No," she said. "Not here." Ethan looked at her, full and direct. "You know what I was thinking," he said, "when you were on that stand." "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about the train platform," he said. "The first day. What I said. Those 4 words." He paused. "I've said a great deal in my life that I've been wrong about. That was the wrongest." His voice was steady, but beneath it was something that had been quiet for a very long time, and was only now finally fully awake. "I said you weren't what I requested." "You did," Clara said. "I was right," he said. "You weren't what I requested." He held her gaze. "You were what this ranch needed, what I needed, and I didn't have the sense to request it because I didn't know it existed." Clara looked at this man, this complicated, careful, quietly magnificent man, who had spent 3 years closing himself down, and 11 weeks having that decision steadily, gently, irreversibly reversed. "Ethan," she said. "Yes," he said. Whatever the question was, he answered it the same way he'd answered her 3 weeks ago when she'd asked if he trusted her. Without hesitation, without condition. She stepped forward and put her arms around him. He held her, not tentatively, not with the careful management he applied to everything else, but the way a person holds something they had and almost lost, and will not be careless with again. Around them, Willow Creek carried on. Roy was laughing at something Margaret said. Luke Harper had found someone his age in the crowd and was talking about horses with the enthusiasm of a young man who has recently discovered that his passion is also his work. Samuel Carter was standing with his hands in his pockets watching the courthouse steps, and on his face was the particular expression of a man who has decided the world is still worth living in, not all at once, not without effort, but decidedly, truly. And Thomas Reed was at the edge of the crowd looking at Clara and Ethan, and he was smiling. The real smile. The one he'd shown the morning Clara had sat across from him and listened to him talk about Juniper. The smile of a man who knows that some things against all reasonable expectation turn out exactly the way they should. They drove home in the late afternoon. All of them together. Ethan and Clara in the first wagon. Roy and Margaret following the cowboys ahead on horseback with the easy, loose-limbed comfort of men returning from something they are proud to have witnessed. Mrs. Alcott had a meal waiting. She had known with the particular certainty of a woman who does not deal in doubt that they would come home with something worth celebrating. She had cooked accordingly. They ate around the long kitchen table, all of them with no assigned order and no formality and no silence that wasn't comfortable. Thomas Reed told another story. Luke talked about the new training approach he was developing for the 2 young horses in the North Barn. Samuel asked Margaret Whitfield about the Merriweather operation and whether she needed anything in the next few weeks, and the offer was so genuine and so direct that Margaret looked at him for a moment before answering, as though making sure she'd heard it correctly. She had. She accepted. After dinner, when the table had been cleared and the kitchen had settled into its night quiet, Clara walked out to the porch. The Wyoming sky was doing what it did at this hour, assembling itself into something that could not be described, only witnessed. She didn't try to describe it. She stood in it and felt it the way she felt everything here, as something real and permanent and entirely hers. Ethan came out and stood beside her. They stood there for a while. "Your sister wrote back," he said. "The letter came yesterday. I forgot to tell you with everything." "What did she say?" "I didn't open it." He paused. "But Mrs. Alcott said the handwriting on the envelope looked excited." Clara smiled. "She has excited handwriting. She writes like she talks in a hurry." "You'll have to write her again," Ethan said. "Tell her what happened." "I'll need several pages," Clara said. "You can have as many as you need." They stood in the quiet. "Ethan," Clara said. The morning I arrived, when you said those 4 words." She paused. "I almost got back on the train." He was quiet for a moment. "What stopped you?" he asked. Clara looked at the enormous Wyoming dark, the stars coming out now, one and then many, and then too many to separate. And she thought about her mother at the kitchen table at 4:30 in the morning. About a banker who had tried to dismiss a woman with 2 years of ledger records and been made to sit still and read them. About the particular discipline of choosing in the moment when leaving is easier to stay. "I wanted to see what it looked like," she said, "when something that started wrong turned into something right." Ethan took her hand. He held it the same way he had at the kitchen table the night before the hearing. Fully, with certainty, with the particular commitment of a man who has decided this is what he is holding on to. "Is it what you wanted to see?" he asked. Clara looked out at the land. At her land. At the 12,000 acres of it breathing in the dark, tended by people who had chosen to be there, held together by work and loyalty, and the daily unglamorous, irreplaceable act of showing up. She looked at the man beside her. "It's better," she said. And it was. The woman who had arrived at Willow Creek with one suitcase and a broken latch, and 4 words of cold greeting, had not won the heart of every cowboy on the frontier by being what anyone expected. She had won it the only way any real thing is ever won, by being entirely stubbornly, courageously herself, and by refusing in every moment that tested her to be anything less. By sunrise, Caldwell Ridge was hers. It had always been going to be. She just had to be the one to know it first.